Alright guys, welcome back. This is our final video in Unit 5. We're going to close out this topic by looking at the failure of Reconstruction. So in our last video we talked about what Reconstruction was. It was this attempt to kind of put America back together after the Civil War, putting in place legal protections for freedmen and such. And now we're going to look at how Reconstruction kind of goes off the rails. So in what ways can Reconstruction be viewed as a failure? That's our guiding question we're going to look at today. And we're going to begin with a pretty infamous group, the Ku Klux Klan. And you may not know this, but the KKK was founded here in Tennessee, specifically a town called Pulaski, which is down in the southern part of Tennessee. Now, the KKK was also known as the Invisible Empire of the South. And one of the founding members was a Confederate general from the Civil War, Nathan Bedford Forrest. So the purpose of the KKK, what was it? Well, it was a combination of intimidation and terror, really, is what it was. So if you have a situation in which African American men can now vote, that gives them potential political power that could weaken the whites' control and hold over the South. And so the KKK was a means of terrorizing blacks into not voting, and to continue their sort of traditional roles in the South of being subservient. Again, we would call this a terrorist organization in the modern sense. And just some pretty disturbing images here of the KKK. Now, eventually what's going to happen is the federal government's going to pass a series of laws called the Force Acts. And what these do is authorize the federal government to use troops to literally root out and crush the KKK. And so the KKK is kind of an open organization. It's forced to go underground. It's forced to change some of its behaviors to kind of conform with the laws, and it largely fades away, and it won't really resurface in a major way until the 1920s, when it will come roaring back bigger than ever. Now, another incident of this, and this kind of tied to this whole idea of using violence and intimidation to weaken the black population of the South, is just a tragic moment that is kind of, I won't say forgotten, but it's certainly not something a lot of people know about. It's called the Colfax Massacre. This took place in Louisiana in 1873. There was a disputed election which led to high tensions. A militia was called out, and in battles, 150 freedmen were killed. So this is, a really dark moment in American history. All right, well, let's do some economics now. So we're going to look at something called sharecropping. And if you're not familiar with sharecropping, the reason it's called share in the sharecropping is that it was basically you would be working and you would owe a share of your labor and your produce to whoever loaned out that stuff that you're using. We'll get into those details in a second. First, though, let's look at the kind of the situation of the South. Certainly, the plantation owners had suffered as a result of the Civil War. However, they still owned vast swaths of land, and they still had the need for a labor force. And since they couldn't enslave people any longer, they had to find a way of keeping that labor going, cheap, affordable labor. That's where sharecropping comes in, also known as the crop lien system. So the way this would work is the landlord would usually provide supplies like seed or whatever farming implements you would need, and then you would have to return that loan in the form of a share of the crop. So you would owe basically about half of your harvest to the landowner. Now, this was a pretty uneven system, one in which debts would continue to grow, and they were almost impossible to pay off. And this would keep sharecroppers indebted and poor and stuck on the land. And this is a debt that's going to pass from generation to generation. So it's almost like slavery version 2.0 is going to be across the South. And you can see areas where sharecroppers where it was most intense. Places like South Carolina, Georgia, Texas, Alabama. This is where sharecropping was by far the most popular. Now, it turns out sharecropping is not just going to be a thing geared towards poor blacks. It's also going to be geared towards poor whites. So you're going to have just basically poor people in the South stuck in this really rough cycle here called sharecropping. So here's an example of what I'm talking about, guys. Here's 1860. You got your plantation with slave quarters and the master's house and all that. And that same plantation 21 years later, there may not be slave quarters anymore, but you'll notice most of those workers still live on that same land, and they are sharecroppers now. All right, let's now look at something called the Redeemers. So in 1872, a law was passed by Congress called the Amnesty Act. And what this would do is it would allow former Confederate officials to run for and hold office. So you have people who had been in the highest positions of power in the Confederacy, who, I mean, by almost any definition you can imagine, were traitors who now can hold office. They can be elected to Congress. And what this is going to do is it's going to allow the Southern Democrats to kind of have a rebirth, regain strength, and start to have a stranglehold on the South once again. And the Republicans are going to slowly but surely lose their control over the South. Now, these white Democrats were called Redeemers. Their goal is to try to redeem or make better or kind of almost turn back the clock on the South and bring back so-called home rule. Home rule, a reference to the fact that it should be Democrats ruling the South, and get those Republicans out of here, get the Northern people out of here. Let's maintain Southern supremacy. All right, now we're going to look at the Compromise of 1877. So in 1876, we had a presidential election in which the Republican candidate was Rutherford B. Hayes, and his Democratic opponent was Samuel J. Tilden. And look at the Electoral College votes. You'll notice Tilden won. We all remember President Tilden, right? Well, no, you don't, because he didn't become president, ironically enough. The reason was there were 4 states, and you can see them here on the map. These states had disputed election returns. So 20 electoral votes are up for grabs. Both sides are arguing they deserve them. Tilden says, well, hey, I've got more popular votes anyway, so it only makes sense that I should get those votes. And there's a deadlock. And this goes on for weeks, actually goes on for months. And it wasn't until, almost Inauguration Day, this thing is finally hammered out. So let's make a prediction. The South would be willing to allow Hayes to become president if the North would remove remaining soldiers from the South. Again, Compromise of 1877, Democrats agree, okay, Rutherford B. Hayes, you may have got fewer votes, but you can become president. We'll make sure you get through in the Electoral College, with the understanding that this would be the removal of the final soldiers in the South. Remember the Reconstruction, the military Reconstruction phase, where we have these different federal districts and soldiers down there. That'll be basically taken off the board. And so the Compromise of 1877 then marks the end of Reconstruction. It had been basically fading away anyways, but now it's more or less official. Reconstruction is over. And Northern Republicans basically have turned their backs on the freedmen of the South, who were overwhelmingly Republican because they just didn't feel like the South was worth their time. So the effects of this are pretty pronounced. What's going to happen going forward is that in many of these southern localities, the 14th and 15th Amendment, which guaranteed citizenship, equal protection of the law, and suffrage, they're going to be basically ignored. Okay, they'll find all kinds of ways around those constitutional amendments in the South. And the North, they know this is going on. They just, frankly, are kind of apathetic about it. They are tired of Reconstruction. They're tired of talking about the Civil War. They would rather just kind of move on. And so a couple of examples of some of these tools, things like a literacy test. If you couldn't pass the literacy test, you wouldn't be allowed to vote. There's also a poll tax. It, would obviously hurt poor people because they couldn't pay the tax, therefore they couldn't vote. And then there's also just out and out intimidation. You better not vote if you know what's good for you, kind of thing, and to keep black population from voting. And so Reconstruction really is one of the great missed opportunities in American history. What could have been was a revamp of the South, where African Americans were given not just freedom, but true opportunity in the South. They could have redistributed land, perhaps, and given these people a piece of the American dream. Give them land, give them a chance to advance, get their kids into school, and get them voting and all this stuff, and maybe things could have happened differently, but that's not what happened. Reconstruction is really kind of a sad ending to a sad story of slavery and civil war. All right, so that, guys, is it for period 5. We are finally done. I know it's a long period, right? There's so much going on. So as you look back at period 5, definitely think back to things like Manifest Destiny, the Western migration, new lands acquired in the Mexican War, and how those new lands actually led to sectional tensions arising. And then think back to things like the Missouri Compromise, the Kansas-Nebraska Act, the Compromise of 1850, all those steps on the road to the Civil War. Go back and review those. Also review what happened during the war, why the Union won, and then finally make sure you know what Reconstruction was, know your 3 different phases, and also why it just never quite did what it was intended to do. So that's it for period 5, guys. In period 6, we're going to get into a time period where a lot of Americans don't know that much about. It's something called the Gilded Age. Basically, it's the time period between the Civil War and World War I. A lot going on and a lot to learn.